Imagine taking a simple job to make ends meet, something you've done 100 times before. You're asked to look after a house, an ordinary house. It's a favor for a family who'll be gone for a while. They need someone to feed their cats, care for their bird. Nothing out of the ordinary. You agree. Easy enough, right? But what if that seemingly straightforward favor led you into something far beyond your understanding? Into a place where nothing is as it seems, and every step forward feels like you're crossing into unknown territory. Where every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights, makes you question the very nature of what's real. This is the story of how a simple house-sitting job turned into a nightmare, one I could never have imagined, and one I will never forget. I didn't know it then, but the house I was asked to care for had something waiting for me, and it wasn't the kind of thing you'd find in any handbook of house-sitting. It was more than just the pets, more than just the house. It was something, lurking just beyond what the eye can see. The family I was looking after had lived there for years. They were normal, average, nothing that would hint at anything odd. The house was large, old, with long hallways and quiet rooms that seemed to stretch on forever. Their pets were friendly, easy to care for, a couple of cats who preferred to stay out of sight, and a bird that liked to chirp loudly when it wanted one attention. On the surface, it seemed perfect. A job anyone would take without a second thought. The family had a long vacation planned. They needed someone reliable to feed the animals and keep things in order. So when they asked, I agreed. It was the perfect solution to a temporary need. Cut to a close-up of the animals, 2 cats lounging in a sunlit room, the bird quietly hopping about in its cage. The atmosphere is calm, almost too calm. I had no idea that, by the time I left that house, everything I thought I knew would be turned upside down. You see, while I thought I was there to care for the animals, it quickly became clear the house itself had other plans that had been set in motion long before I ever arrived. The family I was house-sitting for seemed like any other family you'd encounter in the neighborhood, kind, down to earth, the type of people you could easily trust with something as simple as house-sitting. They weren't strangers. We had met a few times through mutual friends, and there was an ease between us. I'd done similar things in the past, and it never crossed my mind that this time would be any different. There was Emma and Jack, the parents, and their 2 kids, Sophie and Ben, who were both in their late teens. They were a typical suburban family, quiet, friendly, always in motion. They had this calm, peaceful energy about them, the kind of family you'd expect to find living in an old house tucked away on a tree-lined street, the type of home that held years of stories within its walls. It felt right to help them out, especially since they were going on an extended vacation. I had no reason to suspect anything was off. The house itself was, well, old. Very old. It wasn't a mansion, but it was large for a family of 4. It had the sense of grandeur that was hard to place. Big rooms, high ceilings, creaky wooden floors. The layout was a bit unusual. Long hallways stretched from one end of the house to the other, with doorways that led to rooms hidden out of sight. You could easily get lost if you weren't familiar with it. The kind of house that made you feel small when you walked down its wide corridors. The walls seemed to hold the echoes of past lives, whispers of memories embedded in the very foundation. But there was also something inviting about it. Cozy, in a way. Like it was trying to comfort you, to let you know it was safe. I remember walking through the front door for the first time. The smell of old wood and something faintly floral lingered in the air. I felt calm. It was easy to forget that this was a house I hadn't lived in before, that I was just a guest. I was there to feed the cats and take care of the bird, simple enough tasks that anyone could do. There were no signs of anything unusual, just the usual house sounds, the ticking of clocks, the hum of the fridge, the distant creak of the house as it settled. It seemed like a perfect place to spend the next few weeks. The animals were friendly. The cats were a little shy, but they warmed up to me quickly. I would catch glimpses of them lounging in sunbeams or darting through rooms when I wasn't paying attention. And the bird, a bright, cheerful thing, would sit in its cage and chirp whenever I walked by. It was an easy rhythm to fall into, the kind of work I could do without thinking. I fed them, cleaned the litter box, checked the water. Everything felt so routine, so normal. But as I settled in, something about the house started to feel off. At first, it was subtle, something I brushed off as my imagination. There were strange sounds like whispers in the walls or footsteps in the hallway when I was alone. The house was old, sure. It creaked and groaned like any building of its age. But sometimes it felt like it was more than just the house shifting, like there was something moving within it. The layout, too, was a little unsettling. The long, winding hallways and the many closed doors made it feel as if the house was hiding something from me. Rooms that I'd never been in, attics that I couldn't quite see, basements that felt like they went on forever. Every time I moved from one part of the house to another, I got the distinct impression that something was always just out of sight watching. But at first, it was easy to ignore. It was just an old house, right? So I settled into a routine. I'd spend my days caring for the pets and keeping to myself. Everything felt normal, or so I thought. As the days passed, those little feelings of unease grew. Not enough to make me want to leave, but enough to make me wonder, why did the house seem to keep so much hidden from view? The first night alone was supposed to be like any other night. I had settled in, taken care of the pets, and everything was calm. The house, like any old house, had its quirks. There were creaks, there were groans. But that night, something felt different. It started small, almost unnoticeable. I was in the living room, watching TV and feeding the cats when it happened. The TV, which had been turned off, flickered on by itself. The screen went from black to static in an instant, and then a grainy image appeared. It was nothing, just noise, but it was enough to make me pause. I remember standing there for a moment, staring at the screen. It wasn't like it had been plugged in and then malfunctioned. It came on out of nowhere, like it had been waiting for me to notice. I told myself it was probably just faulty wiring. The house was old, and things like that happen, right? I walked over, turned the TV off, and tried to laugh it off. Maybe I bumped the remote, but even then I felt wrong, like something was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't the first time something odd had happened, but this felt different. The TV turning on was just the beginning. Later that night, when I was heading upstairs to bed, I heard footsteps, soft, almost imperceptible. I turned around, convinced I'd just missed hearing someone behind me, but no one was there. The cats were upstairs with me, curled up on the bed, and the bird was silent. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was walking around the house. The floors creaked under an invisible weight. The air felt thick with anticipation. I shook it off. I told myself it was nothing. The house was old. After all, the wind was probably blowing against the windows, or maybe there was a draft in the hallway. It was late. I was tired. I'm just imagining things, I thought, but the feeling lingered. I went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The sound of the house settling was louder now. Each creak, each groan made me jump. And then, just when I thought I could drift off, I heard it again. This time it wasn't footsteps. It was a voice. Soft, almost like a whisper. It wasn't clear at first, just a distant murmur, like someone was talking in the next room. But no one was there. I got up to check, my heart pounding, my hands trembling. The cats were still curled up on the bed. The bird was silent in its cage. I opened the door slowly, expecting to find something, anything. But there was nothing. Just empty hallways and rooms. No signs of life. I closed the door, told myself I was imagining things, and tried to go back to sleep. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but the unease didn't leave. It felt like the house itself was alive, aware of my presence, watching me, listening. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was never truly alone. The next morning, I woke up and tried to convince myself that it was just a bad night, that it was the house settling or the wind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I thought about leaving, packing up and heading home. But I didn't. I stayed. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was pride. I told myself that it was just the house, and that it would pass. After all, I'd taken the job to help them out, and I wasn't the kind of person to run from something as trivial as strange noises. And yet, despite everything, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was trying to tell me something, that it was holding something back. As the day wore on, the unsettling feelings faded slightly, but I knew, deep down, I hadn't heard the last of whatever this house had to offer. That first night, it was only the beginning. It was the third day that everything started to get worse. At first, I thought it was just me. Maybe I was being paranoid or overthinking things. But after a few days, the house was beginning to feel more alive. The strange occurrences weren't just limited to the first night anymore. They were happening regularly, small things at first, but they were adding up. Objects were moving when I wasn't around. I remember walking into the kitchen one morning and there, on the counter, was a mug I hadn't left there. I swear I'd put it in the sink the night before. At first, I thought maybe I was losing my mind, maybe I'd forgotten where I put it. But then I noticed something else. The fridge door was slightly ajar, even though I was sure I'd closed it before heading to bed. I couldn't explain it. And it wasn't just objects. The sounds. At night, I'd hear things creaking floorboards, like someone walking upstairs. But when I went to check, the house would be empty. The worst part, the animals. The cats who had been sweet and docile when I first arrived began acting strange. They'd stare at corners of the room for long periods, as if following something invisible. And the bird, it started screeching at odd hours, its cage rattling like it was trying to get out. I didn't understand why they were so restless, but it felt like they were reacting to something that I couldn't see. By the time my boyfriend came to visit on the 5th day, I was on edge. He could see that something was wrong the moment he stepped in. I could tell he didn't want to admit it either, but he was uneasy too. "Everything's fine," I told him at first, trying to keep things light. "It's just an old house. You know how it is." But I could see the look in his eyes, the same one I'd had for the past few days. That discomfort, sense of something not right. Tried to brush it off, tried to rationalize it, maybe the wind, maybe the house settling, but as the night wore on, it was hard to ignore the growing tension. We were sitting in the living room, talking about the day, when suddenly the lights flickered. It was brief, just a quick flicker, like a power surge. But it was enough to stop the conversation. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice tight. I nodded. "Probably just the wiring," I said, though it sounded weak even to aim. He laughed nervously, but then the temperature dropped. I'm not talking about a slight chill. It was sudden, sharp, like someone had opened a window in the dead of night. The cold cut through the air, and we both shivered. I didn't have an explanation for it, but it was almost as if the house itself was breathing. "Okay, this is weird," my boyfriend said, standing up and pacing the room. "It's like something's here, right? It feels like there's something watching us." I didn't want to admit it, but he was right. The air in the room felt thick, like it was pressing in on us. And that was when it happened. A loud crash came from upstairs. Something heavy had fallen. We both froze, and I could feel my heart start to race. "Maybe it's the cats," I said, but even as I spoke the words, I knew they weren't true. We went upstairs to investigate, but when we opened the door to the guest room, there was nothing there. The room was perfectly still, the bed neatly made, but the sound had been so real. And then, there it was right in the center of the floor, a book that wasn't there before. We both looked at it in silence, the air in the room feeling heavier with each passing second. "I don't know what's going on here," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "But I don't think we should stay." I wanted to agree. I really did. But for some reason I couldn't bring myself to leave. There was something in the house that kept pulling me back. Something I couldn't explain. Cut to a close-up of the book on the floor, then zoom out to show both of you standing in the doorway, unsure of what to do next. We tried to laugh it off, but the dread was setting in. Neither of us said it aloud, but we both felt it. Something in this house was waiting, watching, and it wasn't going to stop. By the time he left, neither of us was the same. He left with a look in his eyes, one that said, "This place is not right." And I stayed. I stayed because I don't know. Maybe it was pride. Maybe I was too deep into it now. But by the end of the night, the house felt like a prison, and the walls were closing in. Whatever was here was getting closer. It was the night I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. The air in the house had changed again. There was no escaping the tension that seemed to wrap itself around me. The cats, they were acting even stranger than before. They wouldn't come near me. Instead, they sat perfectly still, staring into the corners of the room, their eyes wide, unblinking. I thought I'd seen them do it before, but this time it was different. They were almost frozen. Not a single movement, just watching. Their fur was bristled, and I could feel the weight of their gaze even when I wasn't looking directly at them. The stillness was broken by a noise, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, coming from somewhere deep within the house. I strained to hear, trying to make sense of it, but then it came again, a faint, high-pitched wail. At first, I thought it was just the cats, maybe a meal they had gotten stuck in their throats or something. But then it came again, clearer this time. It wasn't a cat. It was the sound of a baby crying. There was no mistaking it. The unmistakable, heart-wrenching sound of a baby in distress. I froze, not knowing what to do. It didn't make sense. There were no babies in this house. I stood there, motionless, straining my ears to hear the sound again. It was coming from the direction of the basement. That old, neglected part of the house where I'd been warned never to go alone. I didn't want to go down there. I thought about all the horror movies I'd watched, all the stories of people getting trapped in their own fear. But the sound was growing louder, like it was calling me. No, not just calling me, it was demanding that I go down there. I grabbed a flashlight, took a deep breath, and walked slowly toward the basement door. The house felt colder the closer I got to the stairs. A chill that wasn't just physical, it was like the temperature of the room itself had dropped. Like the house was breathing, alive in some way that I couldn't understand. I turned the knob of the basement door, and it creaked open with an unnatural groan. The air inside felt thick, heavy. There was something down there, something waiting for me. I could feel it. But the crying was growing louder, almost deafening now, urging me forward, pulling me toward it. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stood there for a moment. The flashlight cast long shadows across the basement, old furniture, boxes, and stacks of things covered in dust. There was nothing that could explain the sound. I walked around slowly, the beam of the flashlight trembling in my hand. The crying stopped abruptly. I turned around, my heart racing. Had it just been my mind playing tricks on me? Was I just imagining things? But no. Something wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the sense of something wrong was stronger than ever. Then, as I walked past an old wooden trunk, I noticed something strange, a small, faded handkerchief tucked inside the trunk's lid, flapping gently as if it had just been moved. I hadn't touched it. No one had. But the cloth was moving. Not like the wind had caught it, no. It was as if something invisible was brushing against it, nudging it, making it shift ever so slightly. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, unable to move. I wanted to scream, to turn around and run, but I couldn't. My feet felt glued to the floor. Then something behind me creaked louder this time. A step, the sound of someone or something moving in the dark. My heart skipped a beat. I whipped around, my flashlight scanning the room, but there was nothing there. The basement was empty, save for the dust and forgotten relics of another time. And that was when I knew it wasn't just the house. It wasn't just my imagination. There was something in this house with me. Something that was aware of me. Something that wanted me here, that was watching me. I couldn't explain it, but I could feel it in my bones. When I climbed back upstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling. It was like I had unlocked something that was never meant to be uncovered. I was being watched. I was being stalked, trapped in this house, and there was nothing I could do to get out. At first, it was just little things. Nothing that could really be proven. Nothing that would make someone outside of this house understand. But as the days wore on, the cats, they started acting differently. And I mean differently. Normally, the cats were calm, quiet creatures. I had been house-sitting for them long enough to know their patterns. But now, they were becoming unpredictable. They would sit, still as statues, staring at the walls, their eyes never blinking, as though they could see something I couldn't. Sometimes they'd gather in certain spots of the house, places they'd never been drawn to before. The hallway, the attic door, even the kitchen corner where a small rug sat. They would all be there, together, as if waiting for something. I would watch them, but they would never look at me, as if they were aware of my presence, but couldn't care less. It was unnerving, to say the least. I could feel them watching me, watching my every move, even when I wasn't looking directly at them. It was like I was the one being observed. But the real turning point came one night, just a few days before I was supposed to leave. I was sitting in the living room, watching TV, when I heard the soft padding of paws on the floor. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I looked over and saw something that I still can't explain. All four of them, they were in the room. At once. They had been nowhere near me a few moments before, and yet here they were, all four cats, gathered in a circle, staring at me as though I had been summoned. They weren't just sitting, either they were standing rigidly, their bodies tense. It felt like they were waiting for something or someone. But it was the way they moved, or rather, how they didn't eat, that made my heart race. Their movements were stiff, unnatural. It was as if they were being controlled by something. They didn't blink, didn't look away from me, not once. And it wasn't just me they were watching. It was like they were watching the very air around me, as though they were sensing something I couldn't see. I tried to move. I thought I stood up, or maybe spoke to them. They'd break the trance. But they didn't. They stayed rooted to the floor, like statues. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't explain it. They were no longer the cats I'd known, they were something other. I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving them. And that was when I felt it, the unmistakable feeling of something cold, something wrong in the air. It wasn't just the cats anymore. It was the house itself, shifting in some way I couldn't comprehend. I had always felt that vague unease, but now it had turned into an all-consuming dread. And then came the real kicker, the moment I knew I could no longer stay in that house. The cats, without warning, moved together in perfect unison. Every single one of them turned in sync, their eyes never leaving me, and they walked, slowly and deliberately, toward the door. It wasn't a natural movement. It was like they were being guided, not by instinct, but by something far more sinister. They didn't act like animals anymore. They didn't seem like animals at all. They seemed like something other. I stood there, frozen, trying to process what I was seeing. I wanted to reach out, to grab them, to comfort them. But my instincts told me to do the opposite. Leave. You have to leave. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear. It felt like time had stopped. I could feel the weight of something closing in around me, and I realized in that moment that I couldn't stay any longer. I couldn't. I grabbed my things, not even bothering to pack properly. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold onto my keys. It didn't matter. The cats were still watching, still standing there in the doorway, as if they were making sure I left. I had no choice. I ran out the door, and I didn't look back. I don't know what happened in that house. I don't know what the cats were trying to tell me, or what was really behind all those strange noises and eerie feelings. But I do know one thing: I wasn't going to stick around to find out. The last night in that house, I still don't like thinking about it. But I know I need to tell you. It's the night everything came to a head. The night I finally understood that I couldn't stay another minute. It had started out like any other. The house was quiet, eerily so, as though it was holding its breath. I kept the lights low, trying to settle myself, trying to act like I wasn't terrified. But it wasn't just the silence that felt suffocating. It was the sense that something was waiting. Something was watching. Around midnight, the house started talking again. It wasn't a loud bang or something obvious. It was a whisper, a soft scraping sound, like nails on the wood. But there was no source. I got up to check, thinking maybe it was the house settling, but the hallway was empty. Just the usual, darkened stillness that made everything seem wrong. That's when I heard it, footsteps. They weren't the sound of the cats, no, these were heavier, more deliberate, like someone was walking upstairs. But there was no one up there. I froze in place, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it would give me away. I should have left right then. I should have just walked out the front door and never looked back. But I didn't. I kept telling myself that I was imagining things, that it was just another trick of the house, another weird noise that had an innocent explanation. But then it got worse. A cold draft swept through the hallway. I couldn't explain it. The windows were closed and the doors locked, but it was there, chilling, creeping up my spine. And then I saw a figure, just for a second, at the top of the stairs. It was gone before I could blink, but the memory of it stayed. I could still feel its presence, like it was standing there, waiting for me to react. My mind raced. Who or what was that? I didn't stick around to find out. I turned back, grabbed my things, anything I could carry, and I ran for the door. My chest felt like it was caving in, my breath shallow and fast. I didn't even check to see if the cats were still around. I didn't care anymore. I couldn't care. The air in that house felt so thick with something I can't even name that I had to get out. I don't know how long I stood at the door, staring at the lock, but I finally turned the key, and when I stepped out into the cool night air, it felt like I was free for the first time in days. I didn't even look back. I couldn't. And as I walked away, I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew I wasn't going to come back here. Not ever. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still attached to me, that the house had followed me somehow. I couldn't sleep. I barely ate. The dread, it wasn't just in the house. It was inside me. I called the family the next morning, told them I couldn't finish the job, and left it at that. I didn't tell them everything. I couldn't. They wouldn't have believed me, not in a million years. But I'll tell you this, I haven't been back. Not once. I don't know what was in that house, or what was behind all those strange things that happened. But I do know this: some things are better left unexplained. Some houses are best left empty. And some jobs are better left undone. Looking back, I can't help but wonder if I ever truly understood what happened during that time. I didn't tell you everything. There are things I didn't find out until later. Things that might have explained some of what I saw, heard, and felt. After I left the house, I thought I'd put it all behind me. I tried to forget the feeling of being watched, the footsteps that echoed when no one was there, the sounds of whispers in the walls. But a few weeks later, I found out something that shook me to the core. The family I was house-sitting for, they'd been through their own share of strange events. They'd experienced things that they didn't want to talk about. Turns out, this wasn't the first time they had to hire someone to look after their home. A few others had turned down the job before me because of the weirdness. The odd noises, the cold spots, the feeling that something wasn't right. But no one had ever talked about it openly. When I spoke to the family again, they confessed something that sent a chill down my spine. They'd known about the house's history. It wasn't just an old building with creaky floorboards. No, the house had a past. A dark one, and not just the kind you find in the news. They told me about the former owner, the one who had lived there before them. A man who had mysteriously disappeared without a trace. His disappearance was never solved. And as for the house itself, well, it had been built on land that locals had always considered cursed. Something about that place had attracted people with bad intentions. It wasn't just the creaks in the night. It was something far older, something much darker. But that wasn't the worst part. As I was leaving, I overheard something, just a whisper at the edge of my mind. The animals, those cats, weren't just acting strange. They were reacting to something. Something that wasn't just in the house. Something that had been with me, with us, since the very beginning. The presence, it wasn't contained within the house's walls. Now, I don't know what to believe anymore. But I'll tell you this, the feeling didn't leave me. And I'm not the only one. There are others who felt it too. People who were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. So, what do you think happened in that house? Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? Or was there something else at work there? Maybe the house really was haunted. Or maybe, whatever was there followed me into the world outside. Have you ever experienced something like this? And have you ever felt that something was watching you, waiting for the right moment to make its presence known? Maybe it's time you start paying attention to the small things. The things you think are just coincidence, because sometimes those things aren't as random as they seem. Thank you all for watching and taking this eerie journey with me. I hope this story gave you chills, just like it did for me when I first experienced it. If you've ever felt something strange, or if you have your own creepy encounter to share, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and hit that bell so you don't miss out on more creepy, unexplained stories coming your way. There's a lot more where this came from, and I can't wait to share it with you. And who knows, maybe your own story will make it into the next video. Until then, stay curious and stay safe.